Harish,
Hi, I just had a couple of questions in terms of what the what the format looks like. Uh, what I wanted to know is, are we going to have a question answer session or something of that sort?
No, we are not like having a question answer session. We were hoping that you would actually present to them how we are going to like analyze a motion based on feminism and tell them some basic principles about it.
Great,
And if they have questions related to it, they can ask you later.
great, fantastic. Give me a second. I'll just start. Um,
Yeah, do you have a presentation? I mean, do you not need host access?
no, no, I won't. My like it's mostly going to be verbal.
Hmm.
Give me just a second. I'll start in around 5. I'm just trying to see if my internet connection's stable.
All right, all right.
Also, are you all anticipating video recording or what?
No, I mean, you can just go on text. That's perfectly all right. I mean, on
I
call.
mean, I'm chill with video as well. If you want video, I think if you're planning on putting it up, that might be nicer.
I mean, we are gonna record and put it on YouTube. So there's that, and like anything you feel comfortable with.
I'm good with video if you all want video as well, if that works with you guys.
I guess it will make it more interactive.
Great, fantastic. Can you all see me? Let me, y'all can unmute and let me know.
Yeah, yeah, you're visible.
Fantastic. Great. How long is the session supposed to be?
There's no limit. I mean, you can go on, and if the meeting ends, we will rejoin.
Great. Are we waiting for someone else?
No, I think you can start.
Great. Give me a second. Fantastic. I am starting in three, two, one. Hi guys. I hope you all can hear me. I'm gonna take a session and I'm gonna walk you through the general idea of what the feminist ideology, movements, and so on and so forth look like. I'll also talk to you about how you can apply the information or the content strategically within debates and how like content flows from foundation and premise into argumentation and impacts in terms of linking and all that jazz. But I think before we start, three things that I'm broadly going to talk to you about in terms of purely content is going to be the feminist movement, its history, and the way that it's progressed, what it looks like right now, larger ideas of intersectionality, and in specific focus, the Indian feminist movement. But I'm sure most of you have a brief or like rough idea of what the feminist movement looks like or where it came from. But just to recap, around the 1960s, the first formal wave of feminism cropped up, which was mostly to do with like scattered thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir writing about the second sex, making commentary on a lot of institutions or a lot of gender bias, and therefore galvanizing women in a manner where the first wave was mostly about the suffrage movement, asking for voting rights, asking for some amount of political recognition, which men had already had. The first wave of the feminist movement, in terms of feature, is unique in that it was largely Western, and even within the Western movement, it was mostly by upper middle class and upper echelons of economic like classes of women who rallied for these rights because these women had the political power or had the like financial comfort to be able to rally for such rights, perhaps have like access to influential political figures and therefore create conversation. That was largely the first feminist wave, which was centered around like the Western world and what the um, rich white women basically, or the upper echelons of the economic society within women wanted. The second movement was mostly about creating conversation around say the cultural impacts or the way that society perceives women outside of these basic rights which the suffrage guaranteed them in terms of voting rights, so on and so forth. So it was a larger conversation about what rights look like for women, which trickled into the third wave, where it became far more prudent for women, like the feminist movement to realize, and it became far more important for the feminist movement to realize that like the way that women are oppressed isn't linear. That is to say that a lot of women are more oppressed than other women, which means that, for example, a white rich upper class woman isn't as oppressed as say a working class black woman, which meant that this third wave specifically introduced the idea of intersectionality, which I'll go into a little bit of detail later on. But largely, what intersectionality meant was that there was a recognition of the way that women are oppressed. Um, I'll take questions after. I'll let you know when I take questions. I'd love to take questions. Yeah. Third, the third wave largely talked about the need for intersectionality. The need arose from largely the idea that while the feminist movement had gotten a couple of rights, a lot of women started getting disenfranchised from the movement because, and for multiple reasons. A couple of like ethnically oppressed women, most notably in the West, African American women, realized that the feminist movement wasn't uniquely catering to their oppression. What did that essentially mean was that the feminist movement got equated with the rights of the upper class, rich white women, and that meant that the working class African American woman wasn't represented, and therefore they got disenfranchised. The second year of that was also in terms of poverty, in terms of those who weren't economically well off realized that the feminist movement wasn't rallying for their unique needs, and they got disenfranchised as well in terms of not seeing their interests represented in that movement by and large. Lastly, it also became a conversation about the feminist movement got a little lost in terms of not knowing how to define itself. And a very poignant way of how this was like spoken about was when bell hooks made commentary on the fact that like individuals don't want to subscribe as feminists, and even those that do aren't very sure about what the mandate of the feminist movement looks like, which means that the movement itself is quite fragmented. And this was quite a like turning point within the feminist movement, because they realized that within the third wave it's necessary, if you ever want like gendered emancipation, to realize that oppression, especially stemming from the patriarchy, doesn't affect all women equally, which is to say that women who are either ethnically oppressed, i.e., African American women, or women who identify as not straight, i.e., like lesbian or bisexual or like any other sexual orientation, weren't represented in terms of their interests. And like lastly, like women who were sort of interested in or intrigued by the concept of perhaps equity or like solving inequalities also couldn't really see a path to what this looked like, which meant that the like defining factor of the third wave of feminism by and large became the idea that it's important to give recognition to institutions and social structures that create these divisive hierarchies, and put women in these hierarchies and make sure that women aren't able to like opt out of or break the glass ceiling of these hierarchies, which trickles down into like largely the fourth wave of feminism, which we're arguably in right now, which is just conversation around expanding what the feminist movement means, which means that um, the way that right now we've moved on from recognizing structures and institutions as oppressive also means that the feminist movement has been having conversations about what integration looks like with a minority struggle, which means that, for example, the way that the feminist movement's conversation with the LGBTQ movement happens is that they align on certain things in terms of saying, hey, listen, you and I have been through the same like idea of gendered oppression, because you and I don't fit the box of the straight patriarchal masculine white male stereotype or like the classification, and by virtue of that we've been victims to like oppressive systems and so on and so forth, and that's made us disadvantaged in society in terms of being able to access opportunities, in terms of how like the social surroundings of the environments view us, and so on and so forth. So the conversation around the fourth wave of feminism is like largely like talking about social, cultural, structural problems and addressing them. The poignant or the most important factor of the fourth wave of feminism is diversifying interests, which is that the fourth wave of feminism talks about larger ideas of political representation or economic emancipation. That means that like things like the wage gap and how to address the gendered wage gap, or things like addressing the like whole conversation around, for example, period leaves, or around equal maternity leaves for like a father and a mother, or like both the parents, both the partners, all these ideas, and also like more equal representation within political spaces, for example, the parliaments, or like people running for presidency, so on and so forth. These are conversations that have diversified the expanse of the feminist movement and the political, or like in general the emancipatory interests that it's had. That's the brief history of the feminist movement. I think what's important flowing from that is to understand that by and large, uh, from the very conception of the feminist movement, it's been very westernized, which means that the feminist movement itself has had interests or has structured itself around interests that mostly cater to like the white Caucasian person, specifically like the white upper class woman. The way that that's galvanized itself, even if and when there has been some sort of representation of, like, say, African American women, or some sort of representation of women who aren't white, who are perhaps of Hispanic descent, there still is a disparity in terms of cultural interests, and flowing from that economic, political, and like social interests, which means that like there is a dissonance in the way that the Western influence has created itself, that lends us to understanding intersectionality on multiple levels. Broadly, intersectionality can be understood in terms of class, caste, religion, um, ethnic identities, and in general like geopolitical spaces or geographical spaces that you occupy. That means that a feminist movement in, say, America looks quite different from a feminist movement in India or in like the Middle Eastern nations. That is to say that now the conversation specifically in the fourth wave of feminism is also around a couple of things in terms of differing agendas, which means that while the underlying foundation still remains the emancipation of women from patriarchy, and we'll get to like patriarchy in a bit, but the emancipation of women from patriarchy, while that is a common goal across like different feminists across the globe, the way you tackle it becomes different, stemming from the sort of region or sort of background or sort of social fabrics that you come from. Which means that while, and like quite simply with an example, while within, for example, the USA, feminist emancipation or feminist liberation might look like a woman streaking nude across the street, or wearing suggestive clothes, or wearing clothes that she likes, and not, and asking to not be objectified for it. Those are things that a Western world can handle because of the sort of progressive, like political and social ideologies that it's cultivated. Vis-a-vis, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the feminist movement's way or methodology of emancipation is quite different, which means that for them, getting the like legal backing or the legal mandate to be able to drive is a feminist emancipatory move itself. So goals can differ as long as they underlyingly sync with the idea of women increasingly being able to make more choices, which helps them access more opportunities and not feel like they constantly have to um, be caged by the whims and fancies of patriarchy or what it demands of them. Uh, Intersectionality also on the level of, like, for example, caste and class, and caste quite specific to India, which I'll get to also in a second, but in terms of ethnicity, in terms of class, um so the way that
नहीं नहीं हर
um okay, the way that class functions in general is that women who have been married into either rich families or come from rich families or have accrued some amount of wealth have different access and different aspirations in terms of what they can envision a good life to be, which means that they're more likely to have better access to good colleges or good educational institutions or good jobs or social circles and so on and so forth. Vis-a-vis, like women from, for example, the working class who also have to go through the same struggles, but their struggles are more defined or more aggressive insofar as they are not afforded opportunities because of their class itself, and also because they're women. So intersectionality also specifically means that a woman or any minority gender who's who's been a victim of, say, for example, oppression by the patriarchy, isn't only necessarily oppressed because of their gender. It can also be because, in addition to being a female, I'm perhaps African American, or I'm from a backward caste in India, or I identify as like non cis or non straight. So all those factors are also ones that compile to become layers of oppression, which needs specific addressing, which is why onwards the third wave of feminism, there was increasing conversation about what all of this looks like and how we can address it. So acknowledgement, recognition and acknowledgement of like structures of oppression which target not only your gender but also other identity markers became quite important. In terms of then what intersectionality looks like is also conversations around recognition that the way that you now level the scales is not equality necessarily, but more so equity, which means that instead of having, say, for example, a man being brought down to the sort of level of the wage gap, like the wage you're paid, you bring a woman up to the level to which a man is paid, which means that this links to also things like affirmative action. What does that look like? It essentially looks like you leveling the scales, you recognizing that, hey, listen, or like systems of oppression recognizing, hey, listen, we've oppressed you, or we've denied you certain opportunities, or we've denied you the right to a like fulfilling life vis-a-vis, for example, a man, or even for that matter, a rich white woman. And therefore it's necessary for us to now rectify those structures. What does that look like? It looks like in the US, if a man makes $1 an hour, you level the scale in terms of bringing that woman's 25-cent wage gap to $1 as well. That also looks like you taking affirmative action and like in specific context to for example India, the parliament was going to pass a bill which they like inevitably tabled, but they were going to pass a bill which would allow for like x number of seats for women in the parliament to be mandated. Those are affirmative action measures that make sure that because we wanted to consolidate power and we wanted to occupy spaces of representation so you couldn't get access to it, we are now making special provisions. So despite the sort of oppression that you faced, you're still able to occupy spaces so that your voices are heard. That's quite important in terms of, for example, changing legislation, in terms of political representation, in terms of social, like challenging social narratives, which means that, for example, if a woman is part of the parliament, not only does she have the ability to weigh in on what the general populace of women need in terms of policy. They're also able to, as a consequence of being a public representative within the parliament, challenge social narratives. For example, the archaic narrative of women are quite emotional, they cannot make logical decisions. If you're able to challenge that by being a like legislator in the parliament, or by being a very important contributor to science as a professor or researcher, so on and so forth. All of these representations are also ones that end up challenging social narratives of, because women cannot be logical and they're emotional, they must be confined to spaces of emotional like labor, i.e., like raising families or like catering to household chores, so on and so forth. So all of that's quite important in terms of changing the perspective of society towards women, because in the absence of that, women won't have much say or won't have much ability to make equal spaces for themselves in society. Lastly, in terms of uniquely the like Indian feminist movement and what like the Indian feminist conversation looks like, the Indian feminist conversation is quite different from like the Western conversation by and large. But uniquely, what's important and what's a defining feature in the feminist movement in India is that it also has an aspect of caste. And that's quite important simply because, and let's trace back what caste looks like for a minute. The way that caste is structured is largely that there are some people that, by virtue of the caste they were born in, by virtue of lottery of birth, have been afforded better spaces in society, and those spaces have contributed to better education, better nutrition, better healthcare, better access to like spaces of economics, politics, so on and so forth, vis-a-vis other people who were born in perceptively lower castes. the way that that's functioned and the way that that's affected the feminist movement is that while women, by virtue of being women or by virtue of being gender minorities in general, you're not afforded the same sort of opportunities that, for example, a man is, but also another layer of oppression that's added to you is your caste. If someone is, for example, from an other backward class, or if someone's from a tribal background, or if someone's from a Dalit background, the way that society doesn't afford you rights is by confining you to those spaces. And more often than not, the way that patriarchy or any, for example, or for that matter, any oppressive system or any oppressive institution maintains itself and keeps reaffirming itself is by the cooperation of these minorities. What does that look like? It looks like two things. Number one, the way that the system trades with women is that it says if you marry into a good family and if you're a good wife, you will be afforded certain rights, which means that women are for the lack of a better word, women are rewarded for their obedience. That means that in a like upper middle class family, if a woman is a good housewife, the way she's rewarded is by being like given control of like, for example, the entire like house help or the working people within that house who are like economically poor, and therefore she has some semblance of control over those people, or she's given jewelry and therefore she's given some semblance of um, worthy or important property to maintain her obedience and reward her for that obedience. So one, that's how women are conditioned, or that's how minorities are conditioned into specifically being part of that system and never recognizing its oppression, because constant rewarding means that you never have the ability to introspect or reflect on the sort of oppression that's being meted out to you. But secondly, what it also does is that it crushes the spirit of women on a more like rudimentary level. That means that oftentimes women end up internalizing that this must be my life because I'm a woman. So by crushing aspiration as a consequence of a system, because as a woman you're, or as a gender minority, specifically a woman though, you're conditioned into this system from the time that you're born, which means that at all points in time you're, the way that your obedience is reaffirmed to you is that you keep changing hands with, for the lack of a better word, you keep changing hands, or you keep changing authoritative figures in your life. That means that as a child you're under the authority of a father, and then if you have an older brother or even a younger brother for that matter, you're under the authority of that brother. Post all of this, the decisions that are made for you in terms of education, in terms of the lifestyle that you live, in terms of the physical and public spaces that you're allowed to access, are also decisions more often than not that all these male patriarchs get to make. The way that this then translates or trickles into is that the point at which you have to, for example, the point at which you're deemed to be at the right age for marriage, more often than not, you also don't have much of a say in the way that you choose your suitor, which means that a family ends up choosing suitors for you as to what they see fit. So your interests are always deprioritized, and the family's interests are always ones that take precedence. Which is quite reflective in the institution of arranged marriage that India follows. The way that also you reaffirm that women are property is through things like dowry, is also through, and the access of like the denial of access to property, which means that till quite recently women weren't allowed to like be property legal property holders, and those things, the point at which they're within your like legal structure, also institutionalize the gender bias that exists within society. So that means that women at all points in time are kept into like oppression and kept into some amount of pacification, so they're never able to recognize that your life isn't going to be anything more than what we dictate of it. Lastly, in terms of the way that like all this pans out, is that the way that legality or the way that state recognized institutions either reaffirm or break stereotypes is essentially that the point at which there is a legal recognition of a minority's rights, the society is forced to reflect because collectively we've agreed upon this structure and like understanding or agreeing to or following whatever mandates they set for us, which means that a legal structure gives you certain laws. The point at which you don't follow them, you're penalized for it. So the point at which a legal structure gives validity to women's rights is the point at which the society is also to some extent either forced to introspect on what this means. Do we really think that women deserve this right? Are they equal than us, less equal than us, so on and so forth? At best, but at worst, this is something that protects the right of women even from the most bigoted of individuals, because they're now under the purview of the law if and when they do end up not not following the mandate of the law. That way it's that's why like the fourth wave of feminism has been quite passionate about political representation and legal like changing of legal frameworks to be more accommodating of women in the first place. By and large, that's what the feminist movement looks like, specifically in terms of the differences that like the Western and the Eastern cultures of feminism have, is mostly to do with how our societies are still quite differently structured in terms of being conservative or in terms of valuing family institutions or like the general sentiment of family over, say, the Western structures, which aren't as evaluative of the family structure or don't give it that much value. That changes a lot of dynamics in that women in Eastern structures, for example, Southeast Asian nations, have more dilemmas to grapple with, the point at which they do choose to opt into some sort of emancipatory choice for themselves. But lastly, and I'll end with this, is the idea of choice feminism, which also is quite important in the current context, which is that the fourth wave of feminism recognized that not all women want the same things, and the way that that percolated is the recognition that not all women a want radical change for themselves, but b their radical change can be different definitions, which means that for example, for woman a, radical change might be uh, breaking all kinds of glass ceilings in terms of um, being a businesswoman, in terms of being a single woman and not choosing to get married, not choosing to have kids, not co-opting into traditional structures. While for other women or woman B, her emancipation might look like leading a fulfilling role of a mother and a wife, which means that for woman A, her happiness or her sense of power and empowerment is derived from like being a good businesswoman, grappling with economics, grappling with political structures and all that jazz. While for woman B, her happiness and her like source of power, her source of fulfillment, her source of empowerment is in like raising a good family, giving good values to her children, keeping the family happy, or like being a good partner to her husband. And all these things are things that are valid in the sense that the choice feminist idea is largely that women are allowed to define for themselves what emancipation looks like, even if that means that you opt into voluntarily opt into institutions like family, which have been historically oppressive, or like the characteristics or the boxes of motherhood and being a good wife, if that makes you happy. There are still conversations around like whether this is truly good, whether these choices are legitimate choices. Are women really making these choices out of their true informed will, or whether it's just conditioning that they've spun into empowerment? But as long as women are allowed to make that choice, this conversation will choose to exist. I think this uh, brings us to the last idea of the way that radical feminism, postmodern feminism, liberal feminism, and all these have panned out. Radical feminism, as the name suggests, is just feminism that wants absolute radical change, and their like bar for accommodation in terms of what women should ask for or what they must settle for is quite high, in that they want to completely deconstruct and to some extent annihilate current structures of political representation, of familial structuring, of social structuring. Postmodern feminism is often talked about how like women's choices have been evolving as society has evolved, as the perception of what it means to be a woman has evolved, and more so just embracing the kind of like life you live or the kind of choices you make. uh, in insofar as that's concerned, liberal feminism is more so about taking the current structures and reforming them to quite an extent, in terms of instead of absolutely annihilating them or rejecting them, there is scope for some amount of improvement and some amount of reworking, and that can be done by making these spaces more equitable or more welcoming towards women and like gender minorities by large. That's broadly what this I like this entire uh, workshop on feminism looks like. I try to keep it brief, but still like take up important things. Um, I'll try and we'll pick up a next meeting, and I'll take 5 7 minutes and talk to you about how you can make arguments with all of this content. Because this meeting's about to run out. If that's okay, can the DDC start another meeting, friends?
Yeah, I said that, yeah, we can rejoin in 1 minute from
Great,
the same link.
fantastic.